It is accepted by the international community that it harms every person in all countries of the world. Thus, if Putin commits an international crime in the Ukraine, he has, as a consequence, legally harmed not only Ukrainians, but everyone in the United States of America as part of humankind, and of course Poland and the countries near the Ukraine that are incidentally harmed by, for example, all the refugees as to the consequences. This in turn gives the United States an interest as a victim of his crime. Given the financial consequences in military aid and the impact on energy prices here in the U.S., one can see why such crimes injure beyond national borders. International crimes cause lots of damage and waste of human assets, resources, and the disruption of international peace and stability and trade. They shock the conscience of mankind, as they say. The rattling of the nuclear sword by Putin bears witness to the fear caused and the ubiquity of the catastrophic damage that we see in the Ukraine, causing fear and disgust all around the world. So the impact of these crimes is truly universal. International legal norms establish this individual criminal responsibility on the individual perpetrator, the one who does the crime, as well as those around him who move this forward and up and down the chain of command, the civilian as well as the military. And again, these individual responsibilities, criminal responsibilities, go not just to military people, but also to those in civilian leadership. For example, the United States, the president is the commander-in-chief of the military, and so he would be responsible if he did not respect these international criminal norms and was responsible vicariously, for failing to act if he knew crimes were being committed. It results, the commission of a criminal act under international law results in those international criminals being titled as hostis humani generis. Hostis humani generis means an enemy of the human race or of all nations. This is not about one country invading another or violating territorial integrity or sovereignty, giving rise to a state responsibility by Russia. This is about the despicable, deadly, and heinous actions of an individual human being, Vladimir Putin, human being or human beings who are engaging in conduct which shocks the conscience of mankind, of civilized mankind, and which criminal law seeks to prevent or to deter or to punish. It has become about eliminating the so-called culture of impunity, which says we can do this and we can get away with it because nobody will prosecute us, or nobody can prosecute us, or the government will protect us. A culture of impunity we're trying to get rid of, a culture where barbarous acts go unpunished, and we want to replace that with what's called a culture of peace or a culture of human rights, respect for inherent human dignity, and accountability based now on international human rights law and international humanitarian law norms. International humanitarian law is a set of rules and principles that seek for humanitarian reasons to limit the harmful effects of armed conflict. It protects persons who are not, or who are no longer, directly or actively participating in the armed hostilities, and it imposes limits on the methods and means of warfare, the jus in bello that we talked about before. International humanitarian law is also commonly called the law of war, colloquially, though we want to use another term, the law of armed conflict, which is the more correct term. This is often abbreviated as LOAC, the law of armed conflict. So, moving on, before getting into the specific international crimes that Putin can be accused of violating in the Ukraine armed conflict, one will look at a set of basic principles and basic rules of international humanitarian law, which summarize international humanitarian law. These principles and rules were articulated by the Geneva-based International Committee of the Red Cross, with the input of a lot of countries and non-governmental organizations. The ICRE's main purpose, the main purpose of the International Committee of the Red Cross, is to monitor compliance with the law of armed conflict. That's the main purpose why the Red Cross was formed, not to deal with tornadoes and hurricanes and floods, but to monitor compliance with international humanitarian law. Again, the purpose of the law of armed conflict is to regulate the conduct of hostilities, including the use of weaponry, and the protection of victims in situations of both international and non-international armed conflict, to limit the harm to humanity, both the people and the objects, the buildings, the hospitals, the natural resources, the dams, the nuclear plants. There are 4 basic principles of the law of armed conflict. First is the principle of distinction, sometimes called the principle of discrimination. The principle of distinction says that in order to ensure the respect for and protection of the civilian population and civilian objects, the parties to a conflict shall at all times distinguish between the civilian population and combatants, and between civilian objects and military objectives, and accordingly they will direct their military operations only against military objectives. This is found in Additional Protocol 1, Article 48 of the Geneva Conventions. The only legitimate object of attack in an armed conflict is military personnel or property. This does not mean that civilians cannot be legally harmed or killed under the law, but it only means that civilians and civilian property should not be the object or the purpose of the attack. So the only object of an attack must be military personnel or military objectives. That's the first principle, the principle of distinction, of discrimination. You got to only fight against military, and you leave the civilian persons and objects untouched. The principle of proportionality. Now, in every armed conflict, there's a calculus made of whether the attack that is being waged by a party is proportionate to the military objective they're trying to accomplish. So the principle of proportionality reads like this: the loss of life and damage to property incidental to attacks must not be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage expected to be gained. This is from the U.S. Army Field Manual. The key here is the word incidental. What this means is damages to things outside of military personnel and military property, or property used for military purposes, like somebody's house used for a base or an ambush, using a civilian house for a military purpose makes it a military objective. So what we're talking about in proportionality is those things that are not military objectives, not military personnel, the damage to them must be proportional to the concrete objective to be obtained. This means that when considering a target, the damage to civilians and their property cannot be excessive in relation to the military advantage gained. Proportionality is not a requirement if the target is purely military. If it's purely military, you can blow it up. The principle brings with it an obligation to consider all the options when you're making your targeting decision. You verify the target, is it civilian or military? You determine the timing. Is there a time when there are fewer civilians that are around, where fewer people will be incidentally harmed? That's collateral damage. What weapons are used? The warnings given before you attack something, and evacuation, warnings and evacuation for civilians to get out of the way so they won't be harmed. So example, if you used a school and there are civilians in it and there's military in it, and the military are going to use it as a base from which they're fighting, it makes that school a military objective that's properly can be attacked because the enemy is using it for military purposes. The question then becomes, how do you attack in a way that respects the rule of proportionality? So if there's 3 soldiers in the school and there are 1,000 students in the school, an attack against those 3 soldiers, if you used the wrong type of weapon, like a bomb that will destroy the whole school, that would violate the principle of proportionality, because the military advantage gained by killing 3 soldiers is far outdone by the protection of the lives of 1,000 school children and the teachers and the building. So the principle of proportionality must be applied to each attack, and you must weigh the advantage militarily against the incidental damage. Now, when we talk about collateral damage, which is the term, collateral damage is damage that's outside of military objectives and military personnel. It's collateral. So if you drop a bomb on a military base, but a house nearby, a civilian house nearby, gets blown up, the question is that acceptable collateral damage? Collateral damage can either be acceptable and legitimate or unacceptable and criminal. If it can only be acceptable if all the principles of distinction and proportionality and the next 2 principles of military necessity and unnecessary suffering are respected. So the principle of proportionality will determine whether the attack that harms a civilian house incidentally is acceptable collateral damage or not. If it's not acceptable, then it is an international crime by violating the principle of proportionality. That's the second principle. First one was the principle of distinction. Second one is the principle of proportionality. The third one's the principle of military necessity, which sounds a bit like the principle of distinction. What it says is that every injury done to the enemy, even though permitted by the rules, is excusable only so far as it is absolutely necessary. Everything beyond that is criminal. The principle of military necessity prohibits things such as wounding or permanently injuring an opponent, except during the fight. Torture to exact confessions or other activities simply used to inflict additional damage on the enemy that does not further the military objective is a violation of the principle of military necessity. It says every object you attacked, there must be a military necessity to attack it. So for example, if in the country 3,000 miles away there's a church there, and you go and you bomb that enemy's church there that is sitting there empty with nothing being used militarily, that would violate the principle of military necessity, because there's no military necessity to go and bomb that church. Now you can make up some things about they're using it as a base or they're hiding missiles in there or whatever. No, but assuming that object is not contributing to the military opposition to you, it would be a violation of military necessity to attack it. So you only attack what is necessary for the immediate military attacks to accomplish your ultimate goal. Okay? Anything beyond that is an international crime. So if, for example, you have a prisoner of war and they're tied up and standing over on the side, to go over and cut them with a knife, that would violate the principle of military necessity, assuming they weren't trying to escape or harming someone. To just do that gratuitously or out of hatred would be a violation of the principle of military necessity. There's no military necessity to kill that prisoner of war who's not capable of fighting. This principle was first defined in the Lieber Code in the 1860s during the Civil War. The Lieber Code was a predecessor to modern humanitarian law. It was used during the Civil War. It says, in general, any act of hostility that makes the return to peace unnecessarily difficult violates military necessity. The principle of military necessity is to avoid anything that would keep the peace from being able to be returned as soon as possible. So the ultimate objective of humanitarian law is to return the whole shooting match to peace and stopping the weapons, stopping the harm, stopping the wounds, stopping the destruction of buildings as soon as possible. And only things that are military necessity to accomplish that ceasing the armed conflict are permissible. That's three principles: distinction, proportionality, and military necessity. The fourth one is the principle of unnecessary suffering. This principle says that it is prohibited to employ weapons, projectiles, and materials and methods of warfare of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. Excuse me. The only thing you may do as a military person, an armed force member, is to use the force that you have to neutralize the enemy and all of its use of property for military uses. So only applying the principle of military necessity can you attack those things that are opposing you from gaining your ultimate goal, the mission. So the principle of unnecessary suffering says if you do anything that's just meant to cause unnecessary suffering, like you want to use dumb bullets that expand and cause horrible damage to a person, when you don't, a regular bullet will do. It'll probably kill him. Or you have poison-tipped bullets or flaming weapons that burn just to cause extra suffering. Those are prohibited under the law of armed conflict. Any superfluous injury, if you shot the enemy and he's down on the ground and he's laying there writhing, and you go over and shoot him again, that would be unnecessary suffering, because it's not necessary in order to subdue that person. Again, you can make up some ideas, well, what if he was doing this and what if he was doing that? But in the abstract, just that scenario, that's the principle of unnecessary suffering. Now, these principles apply to the whole of the law of armed conflict. Principles 1 and 2 primarily protect the combatants. The principle of distinction, the principle of proportionality. So you only focus on military objects and persons. The principle of proportionality says you can only use the weapons that are proportional to accomplish that goal. So if you have a machine gun nest next to the road up against you, and you have to get past that machine gun nest, you don't drop an atom bomb on them, even though that would solve the problems. It would get rid of the machine gun nest. Well, that would violate the principle of proportionality. It would, of course, there's military necessity to get rid of the machine gun nest so you can go down the road, but you have to apply the principles to the action, and the nuclear bomb would probably cause a lot of collateral damage too that would be unjustified. So you have to make your attack and what you use as weapons, what size bombs, what size missiles, guns, bullets, tanks, etc., that measure up to what you see as the enemy's opposing force against you, and only use that which is minimally necessary to accomplish your objective. These principles, these 4 principles, have been expanded by the International Committee of the Red Cross into a set of basic rules of international humanitarian law in armed conflict. called the Basic Rules.